Today I'll be speaking on some work that we've done on group formation and mixing times in gestating sows at a couple of barn sites. So I'll be going over a bit of an introduction to group house sows, and then focusing first on a study on time of mixing, either early or late in the gestation period. Then a study on the group composition in group sow housing, either uniform or mixed parities, a large study in a 6,000 sow herd. And then some other considerations for grouping sows, socialization of the sows, group size, and some notes on electronic data collection. So who let the sows out? How many people here have been in barns with grouped sows? So good, a good representation. Certainly I have the pleasure to work with a number of producers in Canada looking at sows in groups, and that's it's very interesting to watch the dynamic and see the different ways that people manage sows in this situation. These are some examples of barns that I'm working with in Canada. So yes, who let the sows out? Certainly we see that there's increasing regulation around management of sows in gestation, the EU, certainly banning of stall use, only stall use until 4 weeks gestation. The Netherlands imposing further restrictions on stall use after 5 days gestation. UK and Sweden, basically no stall use allowed at all. And certainly in Canada, we have a new code of practice that was instated in 2014, requiring that stall use be limited if you are renovating or building a new barn. And then in 2024, there will be further restrictions to managing sows. We also see a lot of voluntary changes within the marketplace as producers are gearing up and getting incentives for branded products, welfare-related branding, and then packer and retailer demands, and certainly integrated producers making this switch to group housing. So the first question, when do we mix sows into groups? Certainly, we all recognize that there's going to be some aggression when sows are mixed. It's pretty much inevitable, and there's a lot of concerns regarding that mixing aggression, effects on sow welfare and productivity. A number of studies in that area looking at injury and lameness that may occur as sows are being mixed, disruption of estrus, the impact of stress on conception rate and litter size, and certainly recognizing that implantation period is a very sensitive time for mixing. And most commonly we see in a lot of group housing situations, mixing after breeding, mixing after the confirmation of pregnancy, usually between 21 and 35 days. And certainly this is very attractive. It allows you to manage sows in stalls from that breeding time until implantation is assured. You can monitor estrus expression, monitor sow feed consumption, maybe put sows back into condition after lactation, perform that whole breeding very simply, and all the way through to preg checking. And so then the mixing aggression has been delayed until after implantation, and so there's less potential for impact. However, there is potentially an impact on pigs in that prenatal environment by having sows in stalls during that entire period. There's certainly some data that's suggesting that is a possibility. And then looking at regulatory imposition and more restriction on stall use, what other times can we mix? One option is to mix sows directly at weaning, and certainly in this situation, that aggression is resolved before estrus and implantation occurs, and there's certainly some evidence that the early mixing helps to bring sows into heat, and that sow-to-sow contact may synchronize that estrus expression. However, there's also concerns with this practice. due to estrus behavior being expressed in a group. So there may be mounting, and this could lead to injury and lameness, especially if flooring is slippery, or there's slatted flooring that is causing some issues. And then also there's suggestions that mixing aggression could disrupt that return to estrus, especially in subordinate sows. They may be more silent in their estrus expression. And then also the main concern is added work and concerns about how do you handle sows at breeding. You've identified them in estrus, you're going to move them into a breeding stall. It becomes more complicated for staff to handle that. So in this study, we're looking at 3 treatments over 6 replicates. We had an early mixing treatment where sows were mixed directly from coming from the farrowing room at weaning. We had a late mixing treatment where sows were mixed at 35 days after breeding, and this is the most common practice, the control treatment in our breeding herd at, at Prairie Swine Center. And we also had a pre-socialization treatment with sows being mixed at weaning for 48 hours and establishing their social group. And then they were placed in stalls for breeding and then remixed at 35 days with the idea that this is the same group and that hopefully their subsequent mixing aggression would be reduced in the second mixing. And this project was done in collaboration with Yushi Lee at the University of Minnesota and carried out at Prairie Swine Center, where we had a free access stall system. And our normal situation is to have 2 rows of 16 stalls, and sows have free access to stalls. Whereas in this study, we restricted the pen to half of that, half of those stalls, 14 sows per pen, combination of gilts and mixed parity sows, and we have a total of 24 square feet per sow in this loafing area. And we allowed them into the stalls specifically for feeding, but otherwise they were locked out into that group area. Otherwise, it's not really group housing because they would be spending an awful lot of their time in those stalls. So we collected quite a bit of data looking at the behavior at mixing, videotaping the sows on days 1 and 2 for 8-hour periods or 12 hours during the day. And in the early mixing treatment, we also looked at their sexual behavior, mounting and flank nosing in that early mixing treatment. We also looked at sow condition and injury scoring, their body condition on a scale of 1 to 5, weight, back fat at weaning, weeks 5 and 16, lesion scoring and gait scoring, and then measures of sow productivity. And I can tell you right now that we didn't really see any differences in any of these measures except for conception rate and farrowing performance. And we'll get into some of the details here. For example, here is the aggression levels. We looked at the frequency of aggressive interactions, and that was actual contact, physical contact, head-to-head or head-to-back, as well as threats that resulted in the other sow backing down. The total percentage of time that sows spent in aggression, both on day 1 and a combination of days 1 and 2. And this was the total per group of 14 sows. And overall, yes, not a whole lot of aggression expressed. Looking over those first 2 days, maybe 2%, roughly 2% of the time, and no difference across the treatments. Also, we measured the saliva cortisol levels, and this is just to show you quickly the methods that we used and the averages. So we did a baseline before the sows were mixed while they were still in stalls, and at 24 hours and 72 hours after mixing events. And in the case of these pre-socialization sows, there were 2 mixing events, hence the 4 measures. And yes, there's no statistical significance in any of these measures. But as I said, there was some differences in conception rate. Here we saw that the late mixing sows actually had a significantly lower conception rate, 87%, compared to the early mixing and pre-socialization groups, which was a bit of a surprise for us considering late mixing is our standard treatment. However, in this process, we housed the sows in those free access stalls, so that may have been a bit of difference. Normally they're housed in our breeding room stalls. And there were no difference across the treatments in terms of set returns or sow removals. This is the performance, the litter performance, total born alive, stillborns and mummies. And we had 84 sows per treatment here. And as you can see, no differences in most of these measures. However, there was a difference in the number of stillborns, with fewer stillborns found in that early mixing treatment. So that was an interesting result, and we would like to explore that a little bit further. And overall conclusions from this study, we found that certainly within our prairie swine center conditions where sows had access to feed every day in individual stalls, we didn't see any influence of those different mixing treatments on sow performance. We did see that slightly better conception in the early mixing and pre-socialization treatments compared to our late mixing control, and possibly there are some clearer expression of estrus or maybe a more pronounced heat. Certainly all the gilts within those early mixing treatments didn't return, whereas some gilts in the late mixing treatment did return, and so perhaps some differences there, and the slight difference in the stillborn numbers. So potentially some benefits of that early mixing, and we'd like to explore the mechanism of that a little further. So looking at the impact on a message to producers here, I would say that it's a very positive message in that producers could choose a system that suits their herd best in terms of the mixing time. And certainly we do see more producers who are going to groups using an earlier mixing, especially a mixing post-insemination treatment, because this can reduce the space requirements in your barn when you're doing a conversion, because you're dedicating less space to breeding stalls and gestation stalls. Certainly we do have a similar study now ongoing that is including a mixing post-insemination treatment, and this is very commonly seen in a lot of electronic sow feeder systems where it can be combined with automated heat detection, and so you're recognizing any sows that are returning to estrus in that system. So the second study I want to talk about today is on the grouping sows and ESF, so the composition of groups. And so certainly we recognize that within electronic sow feeder systems specifically, low-ranking sows have been found to receive more aggression and injuries in these systems as they're competing for access to the electronic sow feeder. They tend to have a poorer productivity, feed later in the daily feeding cycle, and more frequently they're displaced from the entrance to the ESF feeder. And for these reasons, it's already very common to be housing first parity gilts separately during gestation in these systems. So our objective in this study was to look at sow groupings in a static ESF barn and to look at their effects on sow feeding behavior, injury, and production levels. So this study was done in collaboration with Laura Grainer at Innovation Swine Solutions in Illinois, where they have a 6,000 sow breeding herd using NEDAP Velos feeding stations, and as I said, static groups with 60 sows per rep. And at the time, the herd was just recovering from a PRRS outbreak. We had 4 treatments in this study, so 6 replicates of each treatment, so a total of 1,440 sows in total. And so each week, as sows were going into gestation, they were distributed among these different treatments. So this was at roughly 4 weeks gestation. There was a mixed parity group, so 60 sows with mixed parities ranging from parity 2 to parity 7. A low parity group, so within those sows, there was typically 5 groups that would be formed each week. And so we were able to form our treatment groups, and then there was a leftover group. A medium parity group, and a high parity group. So there was a range of parities within each of these treatments because of that distribution of the herd as on a week-to-week basis. We had to accommodate all the sows in these treatments. So one of the objectives of this study was to look at feeding behavior using the NEDAP ESF records. And certainly we felt that these ESF stations should be able to provide some individual sow data on the entry order, the feeding time, the duration of time spent feeding, and the number of repeated visits throughout the day, because each sow has her RFID tag, and certainly some previous studies by Megan Strawford showed that, using this data, she demonstrated that younger sows would eat later in the daily feeding cycle. So we felt that there would be a potential for studying the social dynamics within the group and the effects of social hierarchy. However, when we received the data from the ESF feeders, it was much less than easy, and certainly this does vary from ESF manufacturer to ESF manufacturer, what is actually recorded by the feeder, and at one point the ear tag is read, and the ability to manage that data. And certainly this was a big challenge of this study, so we weren't able to get as much information from the ESF records as we'd hoped. We were able to record the amount of time spent feeding per each group. So here we've got the mixed parity group and uniform low, medium, and high groups assessed in early, mid, and late gestation. So this is the total time that these sows on average spent in the feeder each day, averaging for the mixed group around 17 minutes. So somewhat higher early, and then mid-gestation a little bit lower and higher. And the main difference that we found here was that the low parity group certainly had a longer feeding time, averaging 20 minutes in early gestation, which isn't surprising. That's that they had been trained on the ESF feeders, but they were slower eating and spent more time in the feeder. So not a very surprising result, and certainly it agrees with some previous work on time required to feed in these sows, and they're eating a mash diet that is combined with water. So looking at the production levels in the different treatments, we had some differences here. Mostly what we found was that the higher parity groups had the poorest reproduction. However, this certainly reflects the effects of parity and not necessarily the treatment. We recognize that sows are commonly more productive between parities 3 and 6, and so this reflects the age of the sows and not the fact that it's a uniform versus a mixed parity treatment. And I would say that overall these treatments didn't show an indication that the grouping practices were affecting reproduction. But we did find a very interesting result in terms of the back fat levels that sows were able to accumulate during gestation. Here, it's a bit of a difficult slide to follow, but we have the mixed parity treatments, and this is broken up by parity score. So the younger sows were combined and labeled, categorized as parity 1. Medium aged parity sows are category 2, and older sows are parity score 3. So you can see within the mixed treatment, the younger sows lost back fat, roughly 4 millimeters, between weeks 5 and 15 of gestation. These medium-aged sows lost roughly 0.5 millimeter of back fat, and the older sows are gaining a small amount of back fat. Then looking at that low parity, uniform low parity treatment, you can see that the younger sows in that group gained a little bit of back fat, and those older sows in the uniform low group gained roughly 1 millimeter. So overall, we're seeing this main effect that the young sows in the mixed treatment were losing a significant amount of back fat, and definitely an interesting result, and a reason to perhaps group them more uniformly. We also looked at lameness in this study. So the change in lameness following mixing, and this is taking a baseline measure before mixing and the subsequent measure at day 3, and also a comparison of before to day 7. And certainly we saw the highest lameness levels in the mixed parity treatment, but with scores being from 0 to 4 and initial locomotion being quite good, the increase is not very high. So we didn't have very much acute lameness at all. And it's interesting to note here that these higher and medium-aged sows actually showed an improvement in locomotion in that premixing to day 3 period. So perhaps they were stiff from being in the stalls, and then after 3 days in a group, their locomotion was somewhat improved. So certainly not a significant level of concern associated with these results. We also looked at the lesion scores following mixing, and here's the result from before mixing to day 5 after mixing. So a significant difference there, basically showing that these low and medium parity sows had higher scratch scores compared to the mixed group and the high groups. And certainly this was borne out in that the younger sows were showing more aggression against one another, but again, the total score that they could obtain would be a 33. So this increase is not huge, but certainly showed that there was some aggression among the younger sows. So looking at the group housing grouping conclusions, certainly it is already very common practice to group the gilts separately during gestation. And this study showed that the lower parity sows could also benefit from segregation. There were no gilts actually included in this study. So when they were grouped uniformly, younger sows showed higher back fat levels and also reduced lameness after mixing. So looking at some other considerations for grouping sows, we see that this practice of mixing post-insemination that I said we were looking at now, certainly it integrates very well with electronic sow feeder systems, and it has the potential to reduce space requirements in barns, as I mentioned previously. And then certainly with the use of bores and detection units with the electronic IDs, you can also detect repeats automatically and rebreed sows as you need to. There's been a lot of work done on group size in group housing, and certainly large groups are very attractive, and that's what we see in most new builds for these systems. Larger groups are more flexible. You can use either static or dynamic grouping. They work well with barns that are using batch farrowing. Large groups also involve large pens, so there's enough space for sows to avoid contact with other sows, so less direct aggression. And certainly with a larger group size, it's been shown that sows adopt a more passive behavioral response, so it's easier to bring in new groups of sows, and you see less direct aggression. And I had the fortune to be in Spain on Saturday and visited a research herd there with a ESF system, and certainly they are working on a lot of new automations involving electronic sow feeder systems. And in this barn, they had a Spanish-made electronic sow feeder system, and it also has a nice scale, so a weigh scale associated with the ESF feeder. So as sows enter that feeder, their weight is recorded on a daily basis. So they certainly eat with ESF and radio frequency ID tags. We have the potential to adopt a lot of new automated technologies for monitoring sows, and certainly we see a lot of potential there.